Welcome to the After Effects for Beginners update. My name is Dave Bodie for Envato. In this short course, you are going to get answers to some of the most frequently asked questions in the original After Effects for Beginners course. So you're going to learn more about exporting, masks and cropping, layer duplication, text animation, and possibly the most important lesson, how to make animated GIFs inside of After Effects. These lessons are going to move a little faster than the original After Effects for Beginners course, but don't let that scare you. Just watch the entire video and then go back and watch it again, and then pause it wherever you need to if you need to catch up. Sometimes I find that's the best way because I get to see where the entire video is going and I'm not constantly surprised by some new and different thing that I may have not seen before. Now to get started, make sure to check out the first lesson on exporting. In this lesson, you're going to learn a few ways to export your projects from After Effects, including H.264, ProRes, Cineform, and more. Now, in the first After Effects for Beginners course, there was a lesson on exporting, and before we jump into some more advanced exporting ideas, I want to do a quick recap of that lesson. So you're in After Effects, you've created a project, and you want to export it. Something I didn't mention in the previous lesson is you don't have to render your entire project. By default, what gets sent to the renderer is whatever is in your work area. And right now the work area spans the entire span of our composition. So our composition is 10 seconds long and the work area goes all the way to the end. But let's say, for example, we only wanted the first 5 seconds of this because for whatever reason, you know you're not going to need the entire 10-second clip. That'll save time, that'll save hard drive space. So what I can do is put the CTI right at 4 seconds and 23 frames because I'm in 24p, and then I'll hit N, and that will set the end of the work area to 5 seconds. You have to set the CTI 1 frame before you want the work area to end. That's just the way it works. Now, I can trim my comp to the work area, and that'll trim my comp to the work area, but I actually don't need to do that because when I send this to the render queue, Control M on the keyboard, and I look under the render settings right here, you'll see that the time span by default is set to work area only. And when I send this to Q in Adobe Media Encoder, by default, if I click on the preset here, it's going to open up so we can tweak all of the settings. The one thing that I wanted to point out is that the source range for this render is the work area. So by default, whatever is in the work area is the thing that gets rendered. So you want to make sure you have your work area set correctly. If you don't do anything, your work area is probably going to be your entire comp. But like I said before, you don't always want to render your entire comp. So most of the time you want to throw things over to Adobe Media Encoder because they will render faster. One thing to note, whatever settings you have in the render queue, if you send it to the render queue first and then send it over to Adobe Media Encoder, these settings, so the output module here, it says Cineform 10-bit, that is the codec that's being used. You can see that the format over here is H.264. So unlike Premiere Pro, when you throw things over to Adobe Media Encoder, it does not maintain the same file extension and codec and all of that. So you want to make sure that your format, your preset, and your output destination is set correctly before you hit the encode or start queue button right here. Otherwise, you're going to have to do it again, and that's no fun. Now, you can send things directly to Adobe Media Encoder. If you're in your comp here, you can go to Composition, Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue, or use the keyboard shortcut Control-Alt-M. For whatever reason, on my system with my keystroke viewer here, Control-Alt-M is not working, which is sort of annoying. But I'm pretty sure it's going to work on your system. But you can also use the menu here or send it to the render queue. Now, I've purposely left this render item, which has already been completed, in the render queue so that you could see this time right here. Now, I did a render test to demonstrate the difference, the time difference, in rendering this comp right here, which is really pretty simple. I have 2 photos, an After Effects camera, so this is a 2.5D scene, and I have an adjustment layer here with some grain. Those elements there, mostly the grain, really make the rendering in the After Effects render queue take forever. It takes a really, really long time. This is only a 10-second clip, and it took almost 15 minutes. Now, when I sent this to Adobe Media Encoder, and I rendered out the same exact codec, so I went down here and I selected QuickTime and then Cineform 10-bit, it took 45 seconds, which is significantly faster. So most of the time you want to push things over to Adobe Media Encoder because it will be faster. It's not always faster, but most of the time it will be. And if you are rendering for final delivery or exporting for final delivery, you're going to want to make sure you have this on H.264 and you pick an appropriate preset, either Facebook, Twitter, Vimeo, YouTube, or maybe you have some custom settings that you need for a client and you need to come in here and adjust the exact bit rate for the video and for the audio over here. And you can do that all right here in these panels and tabs for audio and video. For more detail, make sure to check out the original lesson in the After Effects for Beginners course. So let's talk about when you might not want to use Adobe Media Encoder. And that is when Adobe software is behaving badly. This year, I was working on a project where I had a bunch of really simple graphics. So essentially, I had a project that looked something like this, where I had a photo and then some graphics. It wasn't exactly this, but it was something like this. And I had a bunch of outputs. And by a bunch, I mean over 1,000. So over 1,000 different photos and 1,000 different graphics. This is something that could have been done in the Essential Graphics panel inside of Adobe Premiere Pro. However, I tried that with about 200 of these, and all of the titling got messed up completely. And so I had to do them all in After Effects, which wasn't a big deal at all. It would have been easier if it worked in Premiere, but that's just the way it goes. It's good to have a few different ways to do the same thing in your back pocket so that if a problem arises like that when the Essential Graphics panel was not behaving properly, you can do it another way. So I made all the graphics inside of After Effects. They were all super simple, very short, probably 5 or 6 seconds each. I sent many hundreds of them to the Media Encoder, Adobe Media Encoder. When I hit that encode button, all of the file names and folder names on my entire system disappeared, including every dialog box and every menu for everything in the entire operating system. And as hilarious as that sounds, it was kind of a bummer. Now, to fix it, all I had to do was reboot, but you can imagine I couldn't really do anything on my system while it was encoding those 200 videos that I sent. And this was not a problem that was unique to my system, the current workstation that I was working on, because I tried it on a couple of my other workstations and it did the exact same thing. And this happened over a bunch of different projects. Every once in a while it would come up. I was never able to pin it down. So for that particular project, I had to render all of those inside of After Effects using the render queue. And thankfully for that particular project, there was not a big time hit. So it's good to know that most of the time, Adobe Media Encoder works just fine, but if it's doing something weird or it's not outputting the right way or you need to do it another way, just use the built-in render queue inside of After Effects. Now let's look at something else because I want to show you another way to render. So what you're looking at here is an After Effects template that I downloaded from Envato Elements. And I used this as a render test to see how fast it would be to render just a very small section. You can see the work area here is just set to a couple of seconds. It goes from 28 seconds to 38 seconds. So we're talking about, 5 seconds here. Not a lot of time. And in my render test using the After Effects renderer, it took 7 minutes and 16 seconds. Sending this over to Adobe Media Encoder, it took 8 minutes and 51 seconds. And again, this was only on a 5-second render. And the interesting thing about the render times is that if you look at what your computer is actually doing, by opening up something like Task Manager and you look at either Adobe Media Encoder or you look at the After Effects processor usage when that's running, in both of those examples, it was very, very low. We're talking under 15% for both of those. The solution that I'm going to show you involves using a third-party tool, which does cost money, but I want to show you how it works. because sometimes you may have projects that are just really, really long to render. Last year I was working on a project. It was in 4K. It used a bunch of high resolution imagery in many, 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 many layers and a bunch of effects. And when I hit the render button in Adobe Media Encoder, it was going to take something like, 30 hours. And that is a major bummer when you are on a tight deadline. So what I did to make it go faster is I used a tool called BG Renderer. Now you're looking at the newer version, which is called BG Renderer Max. And what this does is it works with the After Effects renderer, and it can open multiple instances of the After Effects renderer in the background to utilize all of your computer's horsepower. So you can see right here, there's a little number 31. That represents how many CPU cores Background Renderer is going to use when I send this render item to Background Renderer. And that's significant because this system is a 16-core system, but it actually shows up as 32 logical CPU cores. And with Background Renderer, you can use all of them. So I ran the same test again using Background Renderer Max, and it took 2 minutes and 50 seconds. That is a major, major speed increase. Now, the only caveat is Background Renderer works by rendering to an image sequence, meaning that every single frame is rendered and saved as a single image. In this case, I set it up as a JPEG sequence, meaning that every frame is rendered as a JPEG image. I also made sure that in the render settings here, skip existing files was on, because this allows multiple instances of After Effects to check and see, is this frame done? If it's not, I'll get to work on it. And then all of the other processors, when they're done working on their current image, they just look for the next available frame, and it goes really, really quickly. And normally rendering to an image sequence would be kind of a hassle, because what you have to do after your project is rendered is you have to take all of those images and then recompile them into a video, and that's an extra step, which is not a big deal. You can do it right in Adobe Media Encoder, but Background Renderer Max compiles the video for you, and there's a bunch of different outputs here. So you can use ProRes 422HQ, which is very high quality, or you can just do an H.264, and it's all seamless. And even compiling the video, it still came in at 2 minutes and 49 seconds. So it was a major, major speed increase. Now, like I said before, this is a third-party extension, and it does cost money. It is $70, but depending on your workflow, depending on how many big projects that you're working on, or really how much time you want to save, this can be a time saver. And you can find this Background Renderer Max on aescripts.com. That about does it for this lesson. Make sure to check out the next lesson, where we're going to continue talking about exporting and explore the idea of pre-rendering. In this lesson, we're going to continue talking about exporting and explore the idea of pre-rendering and see exactly how that can help your workflow. All right, the final thing that I want to talk about is pre-rendering. Now, sometimes you'll have a project that involves a lot of kind of processor-intensive things. You can see the scaling on this video as I scrub it. It's kind of weird, so I'm going to turn off adaptive resolution because that drives me nuts. So this particular project uses a lot of kind of, higher-end effects. You can see this looks pretty cool, but I'm using Trapcode Particular, and I have several instances of Trapcode Particular running like many tens of thousands of sparks and smoke elements. I'm using Video Copilot's Saber to do some cool kind of fire on the back of this thing. I'm using Video Copilot's Element 3D to kind of generate this 3D logo thing here. And I'm using After Effects lighting and a virtual camera and motion blur. There's a lot going on in this comp. And this can be really problematic when you are trying to render, because right now this is previewing using a pre-render. And watch what happens when I take the pre-rendered layer off, which is this smoke, because I've identified that the smoke layer here is the layer that is causing the most problems in the playback and also in the render. But watch in real time here as After Effects on this pretty fast machine tries to render this smoke particles. You can see for each frame, it's taking a couple of seconds. And the reason is this effect here, particular, you can see right here, there are 8,000 particles visible. And every one of those particles is actually a pre-comp called Smoke Loop 04. And in that pre-comp, there are 2 video elements. And so when there are 8,000 particles being displayed, or however many there are, it's actually double that in terms of the number of video assets that's being displayed. And it's taking a couple of seconds per frame to render, but keep in mind that this is only at half resolution. If I kick this up to full resolution, and I were to, look at this at 100% or something, it will take over a minute, and I think over 2 minutes to render one frame just in this preview here. Now, if you're trying to, kind of work on this or even render it, what you'll find is it'll render nice and fine right up to here, and then as soon as it starts generating these particles, it's like everything breaks, and you'll think that there's something wrong with your computer because it'll be taking several minutes per frame to render this. So there's kind of an intermediate solution here, and that is to pre-render the smoke particles, which is what I did. And you can see in real time, it's still not rendered the smoke particles yet. It's still taking forever. I'm not going to make you sit here and wait, but you can take my word for it. It takes a long time. So to pre-render just the smoke, what I did is I soloed the smoke, and I'll put it back down to half resolution here so that it actually stands a chance of being displayed. And then I came up here to composition and went down to pre-render. That will add it to the render queue. You can see I've already added one here, but I'll just delete that. And it'll choose some kind of codec. By default on my system, it chooses an AVI container file. I don't even know what the actual codec is inside here. But if we jump in here, usually what I would do is change this from AVI to something like QuickTime, and then I would pick the Cineform codec, although you could also use Apple ProRes 444s. That would also work as well. I believe the codec that it uses to pre-render is lossless, so depending on how long your clip is, that could take up a lot of space. But doing a pre-render with a codec that is quote-unquote lossy is also okay. That's totally fine to do too. I would probably shut off the audio, so turn the audio output off so it didn't encode audio, even though there's no audio in here. It would still take up a tiny bit of space. I click OK, and then I would hit the render button. Now, I've already done this previously, and then I've re-imported that footage. And then I'll just delete the smoke out of here. To get the pre-render back in here, I just drop it into the comp and then line it up, and then disable my smoke layer here with the effect on it. And now things are back to running the way they should here, where I'm actually getting some playback. It's not real time, it's not even close, but it's, it can cache this little clip here in a reasonable amount of time, where before it would have been a nightmare to see what is going on. This is especially true when it comes to rendering. What you'll find is when you're rendering this for, client preview or whatever, you'll render it, it'll go fast right up until here, and then it'll choke until the smoke particles are gone, and then it'll go fast again. The problem is this is not the final render, and you're going to have to go back in and make more changes. That can become really problematic because it can take forever to render just that one element. So when you encounter kind of renders that are slowing down, if you kind of keep an eye on things that are not going very fast, you may identify some layers that are taking a really long time. And so the solution is to pre-render this, put it in the comp, make sure you leave the other layer in case you need to go back and make changes, because if I did something where I needed to change the speed of this element going across the screen, that pre-render wouldn't work anymore. However, if I wanted to make changes to the lighting or the sparks or basically anything else other than the movement, that pre-render would still be totally fine. I could change the texturing and the lighting on this 3D element here, and that pre-render would work for all of those. It's not something that you have to use all of the time, but when you come across a couple of layers that are really slowing your project down, take a look at pre-rendering because it can be a real lifesaver. So that about wraps it up for this lesson. Make sure to check out the next lesson on masks and cropping. In this lesson, you will learn a bit more about masks and cropping to see how you can crop composition size, photos, and video layers inside of After Effects. So this idea of masks and cropping comes into play a lot in After Effects. And something as simple as just cropping in on a photo or a video layer can sometimes be a little bit confusing because there are multiple ways to do it. So I just want to go through some practical examples of using masks and layer cropping and also changing the size of your composition that can be pretty helpful for you in various ways. So let's say, for example, we have a photo here and we want to crop in on it. Now, hopefully, just like you learned in the After Effects for Beginners lesson on masks, we can do that with a mask pretty easily. With my layer selected, I can come up here to the rectangle tool, double click on it, and that will create a mask. Now with the mask selected, if I double click on that, that will bring up these transform handles, and I can just use that to make my mask smaller. So let's say I just wanted kind of a narrow cropping on this skater photo here. I can adjust the mask to do that, and it's pretty easy. Now, what you may find is if you're going to be kind of animating this layer around, moving the position of it is pretty simple, but if you want to scale this visually by just grabbing one of these transform handles, you'll find that that's difficult to do because every time you put your mouse over a transform handle and try and scale the layer, you're going to end up grabbing the mask. So one way you can avoid doing that is to lock the mask, which you can do right down here by clicking the lock right over here to the left of the mask. And now when you grab these transform handles, you'll be able to scale this layer and animate it much easier than without this lock checked. So that's one idea of kind of cropping your layers. And that works with video layers, that works with shape layers. Well, pretty much that works with all layers, is you can use a mask to kind of crop in on your layer. I'm just going to delete that mask and kind of reset things. Another way to think about this is if you were going to use a bunch of elements that you wanted kind of vertical cropping for, another way to think about kind of cropping in on your photos is to just create kind of a pre-comp. So for this example, this would be skater mask, and then just set your composition to the size that you're ultimately going to use. So if I wanted a narrow cropping on this, I could jump into the composition settings by going to the menu, composition, and composition settings, or using the keyboard shortcut Control-K. And I can just change the width of the comp, and I can pull that way down to something like that, and then hit OK. Alternatively, you can grab this region of interest tool down here, and then you can just draw a box, and often this is a lot quicker to do, and get this to be just about the right size. And then I can come up here to composition and choose crop comp to region of interest. And that will make my comp the size of that region of interest box that I just drew. And now, if I wanted to duplicate this and slot in another skater photo, I can just find wherever I put this, reveal composition in project. Okay, there we go. If I duplicate this and I double click on this skater mask 2, I can take this photo, delete it, and then drop in another photo. And then to get the same exact kind of framing, all I have to do is move and scale the photo. I don't have to worry about a mask and messing with the position and the scale. All I have to do is just kind of move my guy in the bounds of this composition here. So if you're doing a composition where you needed a bunch of elements that were about the same size for some kind of visual layout, this is another way that you can do it. And it's a lot easier than working with photos that are a different size and then adjusting the masks to be all the same size. Let's look at another example here. So this is a really simple example of a composition where I have a photo here. It animates over to basically half of the composition, and I have some graphics right here. And maybe move those over a little bit. I don't like where they were positioned. Really, really simple. And how this works is I have a photo layer here. I have a couple of position keyframes, a couple of scale keyframes, and I have a mask on this layer. And the mask is animating along with my position and scale keyframes, so that if I bring up the title safe area by hitting the apostrophe key, it lines up at half of the composition here. Okay, so let's say I was doing something where I needed to make a bunch of these, and this is the general layout I wanted to do a whole bunch of photos. Well, if I was going to do a whole bunch of photos, doing it this way would not be the most efficient way, and I'll show you why. If I duplicate my Skater 1 here, and I double-click to open, and let's say now I have a new guy, I'm going to give him a new title, but let's just work on replacing the photo here. So I'll take that other photo of the skater, and I will Alt-replace. So with my photo of my bearded skater guy here selected, I'll grab my new photo and hold Alt, and then release the mouse button. You can see my keyframes are still the same, but my positioning is all wrong. It doesn't start in the right location. It doesn't end in the right location. Everything has to be adjusted here. So to fix this, I would have to kind of reposition this. I'm just going to fit to 100%. Reposition this. Let's see, something like that. Make sure that this mask is in the right spot. Okay, let's see. Yeah, something like that. Then move this over here. Okay, well, the position isn't quite right. I want him kind of more here, and then maybe adjust the mask. Oh, position's still not right. Maybe I want to bring him down a little bit and make sure that the mask is... Yeah, okay. You see, that's too many steps. There's a faster way to do this and think about this. That works, but I'm going to show you a slightly faster way. So I'm going to delete this here, and I'm going to set up a new composition, and I'm just going to call this Photo 01. I'll set the width to 1920. So I'm going to do 1920 by 1080. That all looks great. 10 seconds long. Perfect. Click OK. I'm going to bring in the photo of my bearded skater guy. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Shift-H to set the width of the photo to my comp. And actually, I may scale that up a little bit so I can center my guy here. And in fact, the easiest thing to do sometimes when you're moving people and you want to kind of center their face is to just move the anchor point right in the middle of their forehead, and then move the anchor point right in the middle of the comp, and then just scale it up from there. By holding Shift, you can constrain the proportions. And that way it keeps the anchor point dead center and it scales around the right location. It's just kind of a really quick way to do that. So just like before, I'm going to have this hang out here for a couple of seconds, maybe at 2 seconds. I'm going to scale this and move this. So I'll drop a position in a scale keyframe on there, and then go maybe 1 second. So Shift, page down, page down, page down. And then I'll move him over to about here and maybe scale him down a little bit and make sure that he is filling up the frame. Cool, something like that. Now to do the actual cropping, I'm going to create a solid, Control-Y, and I don't really care what color it is, but I'll rename this once it's in my comp to matte. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this solid as a track matte. So I'm going to set my photo here to alpha matte. I'm going to go to these keyframes right here, and then I'm going to keyframe the position of this layer, Shift-Alt-P, and then when it gets over here, I'm just going to slide that over and basically make the X position 0. And that's going to essentially do the same thing as that mask, but the cool thing is setting it up this way achieves the same crop, but it's going to be easier to adjust. Because now if I want to adjust the position of my skater guy in this kind of cropping here that I have, I don't have to worry about how it's actually cropped because that's being controlled by this other layer here. So if this were a mask, when I move the position, I would also have to move the mask as well because the mask is going to move with the layer. But setting it up like this kind of unlinks those two, where I can have the crop being handled by this track matte here, which I've labeled matte, and the position and scale of the layer just being controlled down here in the layer. It's a really simple way to do the same thing. And it's just another way to think about the idea of cropping, but in this particular case, I'm not using a mask. So to really quick finish this up, I'm going to hit F9 on the keyboard. I'm going to jump into the graph editor, maybe grab these keyframes right here, drag those out, and just make a little bit of a curve there. So we have something that looks like that. Pretty cool. So now what I want to do is add a new photo. So I'm going to select my photo 1 comp, duplicate it, double click to open. I'm going to select my photo here and Alt replace. So hold Alt and then release the mouse button. And the only thing that I have to change now is just the scale and position of my photo, because again, like I said before, the cropping is going to stay exactly the same. So I'm going to get this positioned and scaled properly where I want it. Something like that, and then make sure that I am scaled properly over here and positioned right where I want it to be. Something like that. Well, there really wasn't much of a scale there, so probably I would scale this up and move it down like that. Really, really simple to do. So if you were doing a lot of these graphics, this would be the way to do it. Using a mask would be really inefficient because, like I said before, every time you move this layer, you'd have to readjust that mask because the mask will be moving with the layer. Now let's take a look at another comp here, because there are a few things about masks that I didn't mention in the original lesson in the After Effects for Beginners course. So in this comp, I just have a text layer here. And if I grab the pen tool and I just draw a mask, I'm going to create a mask around this in kind of an interesting shape here. Okay, it's not that interesting, but that's okay. And I think I mentioned about feathering in the original course, but we have a feathering option underneath the mask here, and we can feather in the vertical. We can feather in the vertical or y-axis, or we can feather only in the x-axis, which is horizontal. But another way that you can feather your mask is you can grab the mask feathering tool, which is this little feather tool here. And if you click on your mask and pull in, or click on your mask and pull out, what you'll get is much more finite control over your mask. So what I've just created is a kind of an inside feather and an outside feather. But you can see if I hover the tool over that dotted line, I can add more points in. So I can create some areas where there is no feathering and other areas where there is more feathering. And so you can create much more intricate kind of feathering of your masks to create some interesting looks, or to help you to be able to cut out something a lot easier than using just one mask and a general feather, because sometimes that doesn't work at all. Sometimes you need to feather out just a portion of the image, and you can do that like this. And then you need another part of the image. I'm going to hit G to switch back to the pen tool to have less feathering. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about using a mask. And this will come into play when you are cutting out a photo, maybe inside of After Effects. And you can do kind of a similar thing that you can do inside of Photoshop using masks and brushes. But I think this way is, in some aspects, a little bit easier to apply feathering, because unlike a brush in Photoshop, you can just move everything around, and everything here can be animated. So you can take your mask and all of its feathering, and you can animate, and you can animate everything. So you can have this feathering animate here, and you can take the mask points and have those animate. And I'm just pressing G on the keyboard to switch between the pen tool and the feathering tool. So check this out. All of that control you get with just one mask. Now, a lot of that stuff you can kind of do using two masks or multiple masks with different feathering. So you could use an add mask and then use a subtract mask with a lot of feathering to do a similar thing. But this is just a really easy way to do kind of complex masks with just one mask, which a lot of times is going to be easier to keep track of. That about wraps it up for this lesson on masks and cropping. Make sure to check out the next lesson on animating text. In this lesson, you will learn how to use the text animation tools and make some useful and cool-looking text animations for your projects. So I'm going to show you how the text animator works in a really basic way using some kind of abstract text here. This is just two text layers here that are just periods. I have one that's at 100% opacity, and then I have a duplicate called original at 10% opacity. So when I move this top text layer around, you can see where we started from. So if you twirl down in your text layer, you're going to see this animate. And if you click it, there'll be a flyout, and we can animate a bunch of things here. But to start, I'm going to do something really simple. Let's just look at animating the position. When you select that, nothing happens, but we can set a position for this, and I'm just going to push the text down. And if we were just to keyframe animate this, it's basically no different than just animating the position under the transform properties here. But using the text animator gives us some more options, because if we click under range selector, we can set the start of what's going to be affected and the end of what's going to be affected. That's what these cursors are right here. In fact, you can actually adjust them in your project as well. And we also have an offset. And so you can think about this as pushing the essentially affected state. You can see here's the unaffected or the original position. And if we set the range to be here and here, so this is the start and the end, we can kind of push this through our text layer here, which is not maybe the most useful thing. So we'll dive down into the advanced options here and take a look at some more options. The first is units, and we have the ability to change this from percentage to index. Index will be the number of characters in your text layer. For now, I'll just leave this to percentage. We can also change what the units are based on by characters excluding spaces, words, and also lines. I'll just leave it set to characters now. We have a mode option here where we can choose add, subtract, and some other options. If we go to subtract, it does the exact opposite. So it essentially inverts the animation. We have an amount slider here, so you can set this to negative or positive. Most of the time, you just leave this to add and this to 100%. The shape, though, the shape is where things get really interesting. So right now, I'm using a square shape, but you can see we have some other options. And you can think of the square as the shape that is being essentially pushed through the animation to affect what's happening here. If I change this to ramp up, you can see that now we get a little bit different of an effect here, where the part that's being affected is ramping up from the affected state here to the unaffected state, or the position where we set it to the original position. And we can use the offset to go back and forth between these. And we can create something that's a lot maybe more useful and nicer looking than the square shape. But we also have ramp down, which inverts this. We have triangle, round, and smooth. For a lot of things that you're doing in the basic kind of text animations, probably you're going to be using the ramp up. And you can change the size of the kind of transition area based on the start and end values here. And then you can use the offset to go in between them. We have some easing here, so we can kind of ease the shape or smooth out that ramp to give you more of an S curve, which is quite pleasing. There's also a randomize, which for a lot of things is not probably going to be what you're looking for. But that's pretty much it. So if I wanted to create a nice little transition here, I would set maybe a keyframe here for my offset. Set it to be something like this. Probably put it at the beginning of the comp. And then maybe go to, I don't know, 2 seconds. And then just push the offset through so that all of my text was at its original position. And then I get something like this, which looks pretty cool on its own, but you can imagine if these were text characters, that would be quite nice as well. However, you may want the text to sort of reveal itself, so I would guess that you'd probably want to add at least an opacity to this animation and then turn the opacity down to 0. And that way, what we're going to see with our animation is we're going to see our text go from 0 opacity and then start to animate up in opacity and position up to its original position, which looks quite nice. Now, I might also add to that something like a blur, and you can blur both the X and the Y or just one of those, but that kind of gives it a nice little treatment as well. So let's just duplicate this for now. And on this, I'm just going to change the text. How does this look? Hey, check that out. We just created a nice looking little animation there. We can take our keyframes and we can easy ease them. Nice. And you can change the size of this animation or the affected area by going down and adjusting the start position or the start value and the end value. Now, when you do that, sometimes you'll have to pull the offset a little bit, either at the beginning or maybe the end. But you could also animate these as well. So you can have it start here, and by the end, you could have maybe the start position maybe tighten up a little bit more, which will kind of give it the effect that it's starting slower and then kind of speeding up at the end. I didn't actually end up animating this at all. So that's just kind of one very simple way that you can use the text animator to get a pretty basic look that works for a lot of things. Remember, you can animate a bunch of different properties, and there's also selectors that you can add to your animation. For example, if I added a wiggly selector, this is going to look kind of nuts, and then as the animator goes through, it's going to kind of unanimate that wiggly thing that's happening at the beginning. It's not super useful in its default state, but you can make it do some pretty interesting things. There's also an expression selector, and you can do some searching online and you can find out how to do some really cool things with the expression selector to give your text some kind of inertial bounce, and that looks pretty cool as well. Let me show you a few other simple things that you can do with this basic text animator. So let's do something like now. And I'm just going to position this in the middle of my comp. Now, sometimes you'll be creating kind of a typography animation, and you'll need the text to go from maybe one style in a font to another style. You know, maybe you want to emphasize this now to a voiceover, you know, now is the time to start exercising. I don't know. And you want to emphasize this by making it bold where it was previously a kind of slimmer font style. Well, there's no way to animate between these smoothly, although I believe there's now an option to animate between these, but it's not going to animate the way that you perhaps want it to. But there is a way to fake it, and it looks really pretty decent. If I jump down here to the text options, what I want to animate are two things. I want to animate the tracking, and I also want to animate the stroke. Specifically, I want to animate the stroke width. Now, your text may not have stroke on it. It may look like this, because a lot of times when you create text in After Effects, you don't have a stroke on it. So if this stroke color is set to none, there won't be any stroke. And if you do want stroke, you need to change this to a color, and I'm just going to change that to white. If you have a stroke on this, by default, let's just set it to 0. so that we can animate it down here with this stroke width. So I'm just going to put a keyframe here on tracking amount and stroke width. I'll go maybe 10 frames forward, push the stroke width up, and also push the tracking just a little bit to make room there. I'll select these, maybe easy ease them. And now I have this nice little animation here where I'm fattening up the text. Pretty simple, but pretty effective in a piece that has a lot of typography, because you can really emphasize some of your text. And you can do all kinds of things. You can put some expressions on this to give it some inertial bounce. But for now, let's look at another example. So for this next example, I'm going to create a new comp, and I'm going to call it path. And just type out path, and I'll zoom out a little bit. One thing I don't think I mentioned in the original course talking about text is that you can animate your text along a path. And that is super fun. It's super easy to do. With my text layer selected, I'm just going to grab the pen tool here, and I'm just going to draw a mask. Now you can use closed masks, you can use open masks, but I'm just going to use an open mask for now. And I'm just going to adjust the shape to give it kind of a loop-de-de-loop thing. And you can think about this as the path that your text is going to take on its journey. So something like this. And then if we dive down into the options here, under text, we have path option, and we can just select the mask. And that will put the text right on that mask. And then if we use the first margin here, we can animate that along the path. If you hold Shift, it'll go a little bit faster. Let's say we wanted to animate this starting down here. And we'll animate this to about maybe here. And then we'll go another second and push it a little bit farther. And then we'll have it kind of whip off like this, right down like that. It really helps if you make sound effects. Okay, so just previewing that, I can tell that I want this to come in a lot faster. And then kind of slow down and then kind of whip out. Linear keyframes are not going to be what I want to use here. So I'm going to F9 these and then jump into the graph editor. And then with only the first margin selected, I'm going to change this to the value graph and then make some room here and then zoom up here. And then I want to change these handles here. In fact, I'm going to hold Alt, which you can't see on my keystroke viewer here, but I'm holding Alt to change the tool. And I'm going to click each one of these twice, and that will create a different type of handle where the handles are linked. And so what I want is I want to have this section here kind of be linear. So I'm going to align these handles so that they are kind of pointing up in the same direction. And then I'm going to adjust the handles coming out by pulling them like this. And then I will pull this handle down like this. And if this seems a little abstract right now, this will make a heck of a lot of sense when I play this in a second. So essentially, we're looking at a big curve here, and so we're going to go really fast in. It's going to slow down right here. It's going to move along, and then it's going to start to pick up speed and whip out. So check this out. Wow. So I think maybe the in part needs to be a little bit longer. Yeah, like that maybe. Let's check that out. Okay, yep. And I need to adjust. I think I got a little bit heavy-handed with this here, because that should be more like, maybe more like that. And maybe we'll make it just a hair longer, something like that. Oops. And I'll just pull this guy in a little bit more like that. Now, what I think would make this look even cooler is to also animate the tracking. And what this will do, let me turn off the graph editor, is I'm just going to put a keyframe here and a keyframe here. And then when I go back here, I'm going to increase the tracking. And I'm also going to have to pull this back. But what this is going to do is make it look like it's kind of ripping apart a little bit so that when it goes down here, we kind of increase the tracking again and then maybe just push it down. And then I'm essentially going to give this a very similar shape. And in fact, I can just Alt-click these to put the handles on that I require. And what I'm looking for is basically, I want this to just kind of get smooth in. So I want kind of a similar shape here. Maybe like that. Let's check out what that looks like. And then we'll turn on some motion blur for this. This should look pretty cool. Yeah, I like it. Pretty cool. All right, I'm going to show you one more really quick.
Coming this summer.
So let me show you one more treatment really quick using the same text animator. I'm going to change the font here to Tall, Dark, and Handsome. It's one of my favorite fonts because I really like tall and skinny fonts. And I'm going to put the anchor point right in the center and maybe scale this up a little bit and also maybe increase the tracking. So what I want to do for this really simple technique is I'm going to come in here and this time I'm going to choose Enable Per Character 3D. And what this is going to do is it's going to make this a 3D layer, but it's also going to allow us to animate something like the rotation per character, but in a 3D way. So previously without this, we could animate the rotation like this, basically only on the Z axis, if you will. But enabling the per character 3D allows us to animate them this way. Ooh, and that looks pretty cool. So I'm going to animate these really quickly. Like this. I'm going to hit F9, jump into the graph editor here, and just change these keyframes like this so that they kind of spin down like that. I may just increase this. I think I did that a little too much. Maybe like that. Yes, that's right. Great. I'm also going to increase the tracking. So I'm going to move the tracking away, and it's going to have a really cool kind of effect. Yes, just like that. Maybe a little bit faster. So we'll probably get rid of it right here. I'm going to throw an opacity keyframe right here and pull the opacity down to 0 so we can't see them when they're turned sideways. Like that. And then I will have these fade out like this. And I'll also Shift-Alt-S, drop a scale keyframe, and just scale these down over time. And really quickly, I have this really cool looking effect here. And I can also maybe even add some blur to this, although I don't need to use this blur. I could just put on some Gaussian blur because I'd like maybe them to start blurring out as they fade off. So something like this. Press U to just bring up the keyframes. Maybe start the blur here. And then I probably increase that blur a good amount more. Something like that.
This summer.
And that's probably, I think that's just a little bit too long. We really don't even need to see it that long.
This summer. Nice.
Just another really simple text treatment that you can do. using some of these animators. That about wraps it up for this lesson. Make sure you check out the next lesson where you're going to learn how to make GIFs. In this lesson, you are going to learn how to make an animated GIF right inside of After Effects. So right out of the gate, let's just get one thing off the list. I say GIF, you might say GIF. Who's right? Who's to say? There are two accepted pronunciations of GIF. I say GIF because GIF is an acronym for Graphics Interchange Format. And I don't pronounce graphics, graphics. I think a graphic is maybe an animal or something. Anyway, doesn't matter. You can pronounce it however you like. Let's talk about how to create one in After Effects. I think the first thing, and maybe the most important thing, is we have to have something hilarious to create a GIF of. And so what I've done here is I've downloaded a video from Envato Elements, and this is a girl who's dancing. I think the video says girl dances funny or something. I've cut it up in such a way to create a short little clip here where she does some funny moves, boom, and gives us a little bit of smirk at the end. It seems like internet gold. I mean, if you were going to put money on something becoming the next big thing, I'd say this is probably not it. But let's look at the steps that I used to create a GIF. To key this footage, and this is pretty easy to key because you can see the background is pretty bright. Bonus tip here, when you are keying things, the things that key the best are things that have a very bright, uniform background. When you're shooting for green screen, you should probably be shooting for about a 70% or so luminance in the green and making sure that it's very even. And to find out why a green screen isn't keying properly, you can always pull up Lumetri scopes by going to Window and then Lumetri scopes. And if I change the waveform type to Luma, you can see that this green screen is pretty much dead on at 70%. If it's lower than this, it doesn't key as easy. If it's not as green, it doesn't key as easy. But that's just a little aside. Let's get back to it. To key this, I just put an adjustment layer above all of these clips. And on the adjustment layer, I put some color keys to get rid of most of the green. In fact, I'll show you how this looks here. Color key, color key, color key, simple choker, key light, set to intermediate results. And I basically didn't touch anything other than pushing the screen gain up to 110. Then key cleaner, and this will hopefully plug any holes, which are impossible to see right now, but that'll hopefully clean up any holes. I just left that on the default. It takes care of some of the chattering here. If this is chattering, you can set it to reduce chatter. And then advanced spill suppressor. That's pretty much it. Now I put this comp inside of another comp, girl on white, where I just put a white background on it. And so this is what I'm going to use here to create my GIF. Now, if I wanted to create a GIF right from here, I could. Looking at the comp settings here by hitting Control K, you can see that this is a standard HD 1080p or 1920 by 1080, 29.97 frames per second, 30p, and it's 3 seconds long. If we look at the amount of frames that we have by control clicking, oops, that was alt click, by control clicking, we have 96 frames. And you can create a GIF that is this big. However, it will be probably too large for a lot of GIF applications. One of the things with GIFs is you want to keep them pretty small so you can text them and not eat up people's data. And for something like this, we actually don't need a whole lot of this area, this screen real estate here. And we also don't really need something this big because GIFs are generally viewed smaller in context. No one looks at a GIF full screen on a 50-inch 4K monitor, so we don't have to worry so much about the resolution. So we can jump right to kind of comping this again. What I would do is I would take this and pull it down into a new comp, and I'll call this Girl Funny. then pull it up outside my pre-comps folder, and I'll double click that, make sure it's open. Okay, good. We're looking at it right here. I'm going to turn off adaptive resolution because that drives me insane. And so for this, what we can do is a few things. One, we can change the resolution. I'm going to hit Control K again, and I'm going to do something like, I don't know, 720 by 720. I will also change the frame rate here. We don't need all these frames. We can drop it down at least to 15, maybe less. And when we do, you're going to notice that the playback looks different. We can also just kind of reframe this a little bit here. So it's got that kind of choppy look to it. 15 frames per second is probably the edge on what looks like smooth motion. You'll see if we drop this down to like 8, which you can do, it's going to look a little stutter. It's going to take a second to cache here. We'll just let this cache. There we go. The less frames you have, the smaller your GIF is going to be. I'm going to go back up to 15 frames a second by just undoing that, because I think 15 frames a second will work. And I need to trim up my comp a little bit because the frames of the original don't really line up here. So we'll just trim that one blank frame out, and we should be good to go here. Now, we can't actually render a GIF inside of After Effects. What we need to do is send this over to Adobe Media Encoder. And I'd use the shortcut, but with my screen recording and this keystroke viewer here, Control-Alt-M for some reason isn't working. So I'm just going to go up to Comp and send that to the render queue. So we're looking at this one here, and we can just select Animated GIF. And then it's set to, there are no presets, there's just one. And we'll make sure this is going in the right location. Super. And we'll just set that to render. It should only take a second. Boom. It's done. Let's check out what that looks like. Okay. It's looking okay. I hit spacebar thinking I could pause this, but that's not really how it works. However, you might notice it might not come through on the compression, but there are some fireflies in this. Some kind of weirdness going on in the eyes here. But that's not the only way that we can do this. We can use Photoshop to get maybe a little bit better of a GIF. So right in Adobe Media Encoder, we can hit Control-D and duplicate this, but this time let's select a different output format. I'm going to select QuickTime, and yeah, I'm going to use GoPro Cineform YUV 10-bit. It's kind of my go-to. And set to the same output, and let's just let's render this out. Boom. Great. That took a second. Perfect. Now I'm going to jump over to Photoshop. You can see I've already tested this out here. And I'm going to open up that video. Yes, you can open up video in Photoshop. It's something that I forgot, but everyone should be reminded. Photoshop's got some cool tools. And yeah. So here we are. Here's our video. And all we need to do is go to File, Export. There is an Export As, which does have a GIF output module. But I'm going to use Save for Web. And the reason is this has some more fine controls that will allow us to tweak the colors to get a better result. And right away, if this renders like what we're seeing here in the preview, I think we're going to be doing a lot better because I'm not seeing fireflies in the hair, which are those little blue little speckles. I'm not seeing weirdness in the eyes, other than the fact that they're crossed here. So I think just the default settings here, which are 256 colors and selective color, are going to give us a much better option. However, if you don't like the file size here, if you're aiming for something a little bit smaller, you have a couple of options. We can reduce image file size, so we could drop this, let's say, to 320, and hopefully that will reduce our file size. Yeah, we're getting a new preview. Yeah, great. So 320 is much less than half the file size. And we can change the way it's scaling if that kind of floats your boat. I'm not sure we can undo that in this output module. Let's put it back to 720 here. We can also adjust the color. So we can change this to perceptual. Let me get a different frame that's not so motion blurry. There we go. In adaptive, you'll find that some of these may have a better way of managing the colors. I'm not sure what's going to come through on the video. Well, I know that's going to come through and that looks terrible, so I might recommend not using restrictive. But you may find that there's a difference between perceptual selective and adaptive, especially in the transitions between colors. You may notice it could be there's an important part of your image that you need to not have so much graininess in, and one of these methods may look better than the other. You may find that dropping the colors down, so if we go to 128, that's going to reduce the file size. And depending on the colors in your GIF, if this were more of a graphic type thing where it was, a solid background with some text and things of that nature, you could go down to 128, maybe even 64, maybe even 32, and that's going to significantly reduce the size of your file. And it's essentially going to look the same, because if you don't have that many colors, it's really not a big deal. Even at 128, it doesn't really look that bad, especially in motion. Yeah, this looks probably, I would say, just about the same. However, I'll kick it back up to 256 to try and retain any quality for you, because this is going to get compressed in the end. You also have dithering, and this will kind of apply almost like a smoothing, kind of blurring effect. However, it does give kind of a gross look. GIFs that you find on like Giphy, those have all had the life just compressed out of them, and so they have that very almost painterly sort of look. So these are pretty much just the standard settings here, and if we hit save, and yeah, we'll just name that right there, all looks good. Boom, it's going to save out. So let's take a look. Here's the before. And hopefully you can detect some of the weird fireflies in the hair and the weird things going on in the eyes. One thing you should be able to see is this color of white here, although depending on your monitor, you may not be able to tell, is not the same white as the surrounding area here. And it should be, but if we look at this GIF here, this is already looking a lot better. No fireflies in the hair, the eyes look nice, and this color white is white, which is the color that it's supposed to be. So a few extra steps involved in sending it over to Photoshop. We do have to render and then open it up in Photoshop, and you don't have to tweak the settings, but you could tweak the settings. But the result is cleaner, and I think it looks better, and it is just a tiny bit bigger. We're talking about less than a megabyte in difference. And in fact, if we render this again in Photoshop, but this time we just drop the colors down to 128, and then we save it, we'll call this GIF 2. And then we'll take a look at that. I think this looks in motion essentially the same as this. Yeah, they look basically the same. There's a little more kind of graininess here in the beads happening down there, but it drops us down to lower than what you get straight out of Adobe Media Encoder, and it still looks better than this because it's less grainy in the eyes. The color of the background is right, and we don't get any speckles in the hair. So there you go. Super easy, really fast to do. And just keep those things in mind for file size and resolution, and especially frame rate. You can make them longer, but you may find that they are not going to work for everyone once they get over a couple of hundred frames. That about wraps it up for this lesson. Make sure to check out the next lesson on layer duplication. In this lesson, you will learn the basics of layer duplication and see how you can use multiple instances of the same layer to create some cool elements for your projects. So, duplication in After Effects is something that you will probably use a lot. And it's very, very easy. Whether it's effects or layers, it doesn't matter what kind of layers, solids, text layers, footage layers, or even comps over here in the project panel, duplication is super simple. It's just Control-D on the keyboard. Same thing down here. If I select this layer, Control-D will duplicate it. Now you can also come up to the menu and go to Edit, Duplicate, but you're going to want to memorize that shortcut because it is very, very handy. For example, you may want to duplicate a layer. Maybe you have some kind of animation or layout that you really like with some text. You may say, well, that's great. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to turn this bottom layer off, and I'm just going to experiment with maybe a different kind of layout here for the text. And you can kind of keep your other one safe down here and make some changes to this new layer. You can also experiment with adding effects to your layers. So maybe you add a blur, something like a Gaussian blur. I'll just double click to add that. And maybe you want to experiment with duplicating some effects. So maybe you like a horizontal blur here, and then maybe on this one, you want to do like a vertical blur or something and see if that looks different than the standard kind of horizontal and vertical. Or maybe you add a glow and you want to see what you can do to get a really unique glow. And sometimes to do that, it involves duplicating your glows and kind of really dialing in the settings here and getting something that you can't get with one instance of this glow layer here. It may take a little bit of massaging with multiple instances of the same effect. So you duplicate layers, you duplicate effects. It happens all the time, and it's very easy. Just Control D on the keyboard. Now you also use duplication over here in the project panel to duplicate your comps. Sometimes you want to create another version of it. Most commonly, the way I use it is to version my comps. So I'm going to throw my layer dupe here into a folder. I'll call it dupe or dup, if you will. And what I usually do when I know that this is the comp, if this is the final comp that I am going to be rendering and sending out for approval, is I will put an underscore V1 at the end. And people have different workflows. This is just one workflow that works. This way, I don't have to keep track of multiple project versions, although that is something that folks do as well. What I do is when there's a new version required, all I do is I duplicate my composition and then I start the new changes from this new comp. So maybe in this new comp, I want to do something slightly different here with the layers, and then this will be my second version, as amazing as that looks. And the benefit of doing this is when I go to render this, I don't have to worry about what version this is because the versioning is already done in the comp. And so by default, when I hit Control M, this will export as layer dupe underscore V2. Now, the cool thing about duplication is that After Effects will automatically increment the duplication with a number, which is why I usually, when I'm duplicating something or I'm using something that I know I'm going to duplicate, I make the name of whatever it is end in a number so that when I make another duplicate of it, After Effects will increment that for me. So for example, let me set up another comp here. I have a folder called Elements. I'm going to make a new comp. I'm going to call it Rectangle Wipe. I'll do 2200 by 2200. And in here, I'm just going to draw a rectangle really quickly. And I'm going to make something really quick here. And I know I'm going to duplicate this layer a bunch of times. So to keep track of which layer is which, I'm just going to name this Rec 01. And then I'll know that this is the first rectangle. Now, when I go to duplicate this, you can see that all of those increment very nicely. It's very easy to keep track of what is what. Now, another cool thing you can do with layer duplication is you can come up with a really simple animation, and then you can cascade that animation through layer duplication to create some really interesting elements that you can use for your projects. And let me show you how that works. So with my rectangle here, I'm going to dive down into the rectangle and then the rectangle path, and I'm going to make this exactly 2200. Then I'll hit tab, and I'll make this 100 pixels tall. And my thinking is I'm going to make 22 copies of this and stack them vertically, and I'll do a little animation on the first one so that I don't have to animate all of them individually. I'm going to jump down to the transform controls of the shape layer, not the transform controls for the layer, and I'll hit Y on the keyboard and select the anchor point tool, and I'm going to move the anchor point right over here, right to the edge, just like that. And then at the beginning of my comp, I'm going to set a scale keyframe, and I'm going to set the X scale to 0. And then I'm going to go forward maybe 30 frames, which on my keystroke viewer, this says shift next, but that's actually shift page down. So if you see that in any of the lessons, just know that that's not the right thing. It's shift page down and shift page up. For whatever reason, this is reading the page down as next, but 30 frames out, so I'm going to go at 1 second because I'm in 29.97 or 30p, and I'm going to set the scale to 100%. Then I'll grab the keyframes. I'm going to hit F9 to easy ease them, and then I'll just put some nice handles on them. I'm going to switch this to the value graph. Actually, no, I'm going to leave it on the speed graph. I'll click Fit All Graphs to View, and I'll grab this first handle here and slide it this way while holding down Shift. And then I'll grab this second handle here and slide it to the left while holding down Shift, and that will kind of lock it in. And that'll make this really nice kind of almost exponential curve, which looks like this. It's not terribly exciting, but that's okay. All right, I'm going to grab my layer here, hit Y, and grab the anchor point to this layer, zoom right up here, and I'm going to put the anchor point right on this top left transform handle. And to make it snap there, I'm going to hold Control, and that will temporarily enable snapping. And then I can use the Align window or panel over here to align left and then align top to the composition, and that will make sure it's in the upper left-hand corner. If you don't have the Align panel, just go to Window, and then right just off the screen here, its Align is up there. Okay, so that's really the hardest part. So now what I want to do is duplicate this a bunch of times and then stack this vertically. Now you can set up an expression to have these kind of automatically stack. And to do that, you would do something like alt-click on the position and type something like variable I equals index minus 1, semicolon, variable X equals 0, semicolon, variable Y equals I times 100. Oh, that's supposed to be var. And then open bracket, X, comma, Y. So index is the number of the layer here. And the next variable here, I'm just saying X equals 0 because I don't want this to move on the X axis at all. And then the next variable, I'm saying Y equals index, or 1, times 100. But up here, I did an index minus 1. So right now, index is actually equal to 0. And then the brackets here are just basically inputting all of this stuff into the coordinates here, so that when I click away, you'll see that nothing happens, and this is exactly right. But check out what happens when I select this layer and I duplicate it. The very next layer moves down 100 pixels because now this layer, the index is actually equal to 2, right? So index is the layer number, so that's 2 minus 1 is 1 times 100 And so this expression is telling the position x equals 0, y now equals 100. And I made my shape layer 100 pixels tall so that every time that I duplicate this, it's going to move the next layer down 100 pixels. So check this out. All I have to do is just duplicate this and make sure that there are 22 copies. And for sanity, I'm just going to move that rec02 down here. It really makes no difference. It would sort of bother me if I left it up like that. So that's just a really quick expression. I don't think I've gone into expressions before in the After Effects for Beginners course, but that's a really simple expression to just set the position. Now, alternatively, you could just move them manually and position them manually, but that's a little bit more annoying. A little bit of work up front makes this really, really easy. So if we play this from the beginning, you are going to be really impressed. Whoa, we made a giant rectangle in 22 pieces move across the screen at the same time. Okay, I admit that is not the most impressive thing. However, the next step makes this pretty mundane looking animation look much, much cooler. And that involves staggering these layers. Now you can do this manually. And the idea here is I want every subsequent layer starting from the bottom to be one frame later. So what I could do is select all of these layers and then hit Alt page down. Again, it's not Alt next, it's Alt page down. And then Control click the bottommost layer in that selection, then hit Alt page down again. Control click, Alt page down, 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 Control click, Alt page down. There are other ways to do this that are slightly less tedious. For example, you could go up here to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers, select Overlap, and then figure out exactly how long your comp is here. I don't know, but let's say our whole comp is 11 seconds and 19 frames. So you can actually right-click right here, choose Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. Let's say Overlap. We'll say 11 seconds and 18 frames. Okay, that didn't work right at all. It kind of did, but let's play the result here. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And I think the problem is the way that they were selected. So let me make sure that I select them from bottom to top or top to bottom, and I'll do the same thing again. So Sequence Layers, and I'm going to click Overlap. I'm going to set the duration to 1 frame less than my composition, and that should stagger the layers by 1 frame. Okay, there we go. Now that's better. So now we have something pretty interesting looking. And this is kind of interesting on its own, but we can make something even more interesting by using this in another comp. But before I do, I want to show you another third-party tool which you may find interesting, and it's something that I use all of the time for staggering layers. And this is a third-party script called Rift. And I'm just going to load it up here by going to Window and Rift. Now, you're not going to have this installed. This is something that you can find on aescripts.com, and it costs about $30, or you can actually name your own price, but $30 is the suggested amount. And with this little script here, you can do a bunch of different things by staggering layers or staggering keyframes. So to do the same thing that I just did before by staggering all of these layers by 1 frame, all I have to do is figure out how many layers there are and then subtract 1. So I put that right here, 21. And so I want to sequence these in an ascending order, and I'm going to pick linear as the shape, and then I'm just going to click this Go button, boop, and it just does it. And the cool thing about this is it's much quicker to experiment with different sort of layer sequencing setups. Let's say I did this and maybe I decided it was a little too fast. No problem. I'll just sequence everything by 1 more frame by clicking this again. There we go. Now that would be really tedious to do by selecting all of the layers and trying to overlap them again and figuring out the time difference. It's much faster to use a tool like this, especially if you're doing a lot of layer sequencing or keyframe sequencing. Keyframe sequencing is also very cool to do as well. But you can actually use other shapes other than linear. So check this out. I can set this to in, and then I have a variety of different shapes to choose from. And now when I hit the go button, you'll see that there is this really cool kind of curve that's happening here, which has a different effect. So the beginning of this animation kind of whips in really fast, and then the end goes kind of slow. Just undo that. Oops. I'll undo that, and I'll set that to out. And now I get kind of the opposite effect. And depending on how you have set your keyframes with the influence and the speed of your keyframes, you can come up with some kind of interesting looking shapes for your animation. You can set this to in and out or both. So I'll just reset the position. And now it makes kind of this interesting shape here. I'll just set this back to sign in because I think that looks pretty cool. And let me show you how to use this in another composition. So I have this city comp here set up, and I have a couple of footage layers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this rectangle wipe here as a track matte for this top layer here. So I want this to reveal on. So I'm going to line this up with the beginning of my healthy, some kind of egg dish here layer. And I'm going to set the track matte to alpha matte. And when I do, check out what happens. Whoa, cool. Look at that. I have this very interesting kind of wipe effect. And the cool thing about having this as a separate layer is you can select this and you can scale this down. So probably what I do is hit Control-Alt-Shift-H, and that'll set the scale to fit the width of my comp. And then if I take this and move it down, I'm going to get a little bit different effect because of the way that the animation works. But I could also just try and scale this right to the layer. So I could right-click on this, go to Transform and Fit to Comp. And this will change the shape of the rectangles. But it'll look pretty cool. I can also use this rectangle layer with the idea of duplication to create something even cooler. So I'm just going to duplicate my rectangle wipe layer, and I'm going to turn it back on and place it under this footage layer here. And then I'm going to hit Alt Page Up to make it one frame ahead. And now what happens is I get this really cool kind of edge here happening. And I can combine that with maybe a fill effect and change the color, maybe grab this green color, or I don't know, maybe we'll just give it a really bright blue, maybe add a glow effect to this, and then adjust these settings here, and then maybe set this to something like add, and give this a really kind of cool electronic-y kind of wipe look. That looks kind of cool. And this is all with layer duplication. So a lot of kind of interesting things you can do, and you can be really creative with something that's pretty simple. I mean, for this, we just started with just a single rectangle layer, and then with a little bit of expression, we duplicated it and made a whole comp full of rectangles, and then adjusted their sequencing to create an interesting shape. We used that as a track matte, and then duplicated that, offset that layer by one frame, and now we have something pretty cool. I can duplicate this again, maybe put this over here by one frame, duplicate this layer again, and then set the track matte to alpha matte, and I will set this to normal, and then get rid of these effects. Or actually maybe alpha inverted. And now I have something even crazier. That about does it for this lesson. Make sure to check out the last lesson in the course to get some final tips and tricks. You made it to the end of the After Effects for Beginners course update, and that is really cool. In this last video, I'm going to give you a couple of final tips and tricks to help you along your After Effects journey. One of those is talking about some of the scripts and tools that I used throughout these update lessons. And I wanted to kind of reiterate that these tools are really cool to have, and they can help you out if you're in a jam or doing something that's incredibly tedious, but they're definitely not necessary. There are a ton of really cool tools in the After Effects world, from effects and plugins to really fancy scripts that do all kinds of neat and interesting and incredibly helpful things, but you don't absolutely have to get them. My thinking on this is whenever I'm doing something really, really tedious, I look out there and see if there's a reasonably priced script that will help me do the thing that I'm doing a heck of a lot faster. Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there is a script and it just costs too much money. And I was like, you know what? I'll just do it for now. If it's something that I end up doing a whole lot of, then I really strongly consider getting one of those scripts. But, it's always a balance because you can't have all of them. It would cost you, I don't know, $250,000 because there's a lot of them out there. Maybe not that much. But there are some that you saw me use that I think are really, really handy. And those scripts are things that I use in After Effects all of the time. Things that are used for keyframe manipulation, layer sequencing, background render max is a nice tool to have if you are having trouble rendering out things quickly from After Effects, because I don't know anything else that can render things in less than half, sometimes a quarter of the time than the After Effects renderer or Adobe Media Encoder. So that can be handy from time to time. But there are other tools out there. If you look on aescripts.com, there are really cool keyframe manipulation tools like EaseWiz, Flow, Keysmith, and others. There's a great tool that I use from Mount MoGraph called Motion 3 that also has keyframe manipulation tools. It's got a really cool anchor point tool where you can move the anchor point around, which sounds pretty simple until you see it in action. You go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've not used this before. I think I use that almost every time I use After Effects. And there are a bunch of other tools that are jam-packed in that Motion 3 script. It is really, really cool, and you should definitely check it out. There are some other tools that I use all the time from battleaxe.co. There's an extension called Overlord, which helps you get shape layers from After Effects to Illustrator and from Illustrator to After Effects in a really seamless way. And that can be really handy if you're working with a lot of Illustrator files, or you just want to use Illustrator to refine the shapes that you create in After Effects. If that's something that you find yourself doing, definitely check that out. There's also another tool called Rubber Hose 2. If you do puppets, you should definitely look at Rubber Hose 2. It is really, really cool for doing puppets. And you'll also find a free tool there called Butt Capper, which I also use almost every time I use After Effects. There's another tool that I found really invaluable whenever I'm working with text and I need to do something that can't be done any other way other than breaking the text layer apart. So for example, if I wanted to fly in a line of text and then have the text explode and have all of the individual characters go in a unique direction, either in 2D or in 2.5D, there's really no good way to do that other than breaking the text layer up into individual characters. And I promise you, if you try and do that by hand, you will want to pull your hair out. It is incredibly tedious. And so I use a tool called Text Exploder to be able to break apart text layers, either big blocks of text into individual lines, into individual words, or individual characters. And you hit just one button, and the script runs, and it breaks everything apart and puts everything right back where it was before. If you do a lot of things with text, you should definitely check that out. That's from Mammal World, and you can find that along with many, many other really cool scripts on aescripts.com. And finally, make sure to check out all the great things on Envato Elements. As I was perusing things to get for this course, I was reminded that they have a lot of great audio and stock video footage, along with a bunch of cool-looking After Effects templates and other assets. They're always adding stuff all the time, and you can find a lot of great stuff there. Well, that about wraps it up for this course. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope you learned a few things along the way. My name is Dave Bodie for Envato, and I'll see you around.